Getting an interview with an athlete or celebrity can be a challenge even for someone working in the sports industry. My guest on this episode will share some stories on how he's been able to interview some major athletes, including names like Greg Norman, Mia Hamm, Cal Ripken Jr., Venus Williams, and many more, all without having a journalism degree. He'll tell us how he tries to make each interview unique and gives us some insight on how he's made a career in sports through writing. Next on Sports in the Making. Thank you for joining me on Sports in the Making, a podcast where we find out what people in the sports and sports broadcasting industry do, how they've made an impact in the sports world, and how it all comes together. I'm your host, Don Cardona, and this is episode number 24. When I was a kid, I read Sports Illustrated like many kids who love sports. I enjoyed learning about athletes and sports from some incredible writers such as Dick Schopp, Peter Gammons, Rick Riley, and others. I tried writing sports articles in high school, but I couldn't find the right formula to make them stand out. My guest on this episode made his living working in the financial industry and in sales early in his career. He eventually started blogging with some encouragement from friends. He later submitted articles to ESPN.com, writing about some obscure sporting events, and then later worked as a contributor to the Chicago Tribune's Red Eye, to the Dow Jones and News Corp's Market Watch, to the Rolling Stone covering sports and pop culture, and is now currently a sports and sports business contributor with Forbes. And he's done it all without attending a journalism school. We'll talk about his journey on being a contributing writer with these digital publishers, how he's interviewed some of the most high-profile athletes on the planet, and what his approach is for making each of his articles special. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Andy Frye, sports writer and contributor to Forbes. I am with Andy Frye, sports writer and contributor to Forbes, and I think most people know what Forbes is, but for those who don't, it is a publication that appears digitally and mostly, in my opinion, more business related, but there is some sports, and that's where Andy comes in. So Andy, thank you for being on the show, first of all, and second, how did you get to where you are, considering you didn't come up through the traditional journalism route?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm probably more of a writer than a journalist. I didn't go to journalism school, or at least didn't graduate with a journalism degree. I dabbled in it a while, and I've always been a writer of some sort or another, and have always loved sports. And probably about 10 years or so ago, as just one day I was kind of arguing with some friends online about this or that related thing in sports, or arguing about teams. I think I might have had a couple friends who were ripping on the Cubs. I live in Chicago and I'm a Cubs fan. So that used to come up a lot. And long story short, I had a friend just kind of recommend, oh, you should start a blog. It seems like you have a lot to say about sports. And I'd always done some writing, and back in the mid 90s, I had, I don't know if you remember what zines are. I had a music zine and would go review bands with a couple of friends of mine. And probably in about 99 or 2000, had a website that was similar, and just kind of always dabbled. And somewhere along the line, I think it just became easier for people like me who always have thoughts about sports and opinions about sports to kind of plot them and down. And so I started to do that, just had a little blog on blogger.com, and eventually kind of sniffed around for some opportunity and grew from there. And, after just setting up an initial blog, I started to do some blogging for Chicago Now, which was actually a part of the Tribune. It's kind of the Chicago Tribune's big foray into the blogging world. And from that, just, kind of built it up. And I would say probably used my business skills more than anything else. And maybe business skills are very similar to investigative journalism skills. And just some of the stuff like following up and being open to opportunities really gave me a lot of opportunities to do some of the things that I'm doing now.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because, I would think like most people who love sports, they just want to be attached to it somehow. You just found your ability to write about it and then actually put it into action. When you're somebody who doesn't really have the traditional route of going about getting your articles published, how were you able to do that? Because it seems a little bit daunting to some people.
Yeah, I think one thing with freelance contributors and people who write for different magazines, we tend to be pretty entrepreneurial. And I was in the business world for 20 20 or so years before I started doing this. Well, until I moved over full time. I'm 48. So, I've been in sales and in a lot of kind of hand holding roles in the business world. And one thing you learn to do is communicate and ask questions. So, way early on, let's say after I'd done my blogging for a while and presented a couple of it, I did the rants and raves about the NFL and baseball and different topics, but also kind of developed a strangely repertoire of sort of weird, off the beaten path sort of sports. I if you remember the movie Dodgeball, there's a character on the team who picks up a magazine. I think it's called something like Unusual Sports Quarterly or Obscure Sports Quarterly. I've always joked that I've written for that magazine, even though it doesn't really exist in real life. So long story short, when I got, just through social media and just, kind of knowing sports people, I sniffed around. And one thing that I would probably tell anybody who's interested in writing about sports and kind of getting into is, if you meet a sports writer, you meet a writer, you meet an editor, you don't, accost them and say, hey, give me the email to your editor, or how do I get to do what you do? But you can, I think if you learn how to just sort of have a conversation with people, you can kind of find clues as to how to do what you want. So, long story short, I had in 2010 or so made some contacts, and one of those introduced me to Chicago Now. I knew another guy who's writing for ESPN kind of on and off, and what I probably learned from him was that if you're not a staffer, you actually remember Page Two. Page Two was kind of like a, off the beaten path sports, weird sports stories. There's a lot of like celebrities in sports and stuff like that going on the page at the time. So Page Two was kind of like this pop culture outlet. And one thing that I noticed that they did was offbeat sports stories that they weren't going to, probably they weren't really looking for freelancers to pitch stories on baseball or football or, the big four sports, as I call it. Mm-hmm. But at one point I came up, I don't even remember how I found the sport, but I found a sport called Fistball, which, despite the weird name, think of it as like almost a version of volleyball. And instead of having a full net, there's like an orange in place of a net 6 feet above the ground. And it has its own rules. Like I think you can only hit the ball with a closed fist. It's played on grass. You can let it bounce on one side. So it's like volleyball in a way, but it's different. And when I found out that there was a World Cup, which I didn't know, it's one of those sports played avidly in Germany and Scandinavia, Brazil. And then there was this ragtag U.S. national team that was basically made up half of a bunch of guys in Wisconsin who belonged to some German-American sports club, and then the other half belonged to a sports club that was very similar outside of the Philadelphia area. So somehow I got a lead on this, and I just kind of looked it up and probably emailed the chairman of the U.S. Fistball Association, who is a guy who, has a day job like us, like a lot of us out there, and his passion was fistball, and we set up a time to kind of talk about it, and I pitched this story to ESPN Page Two, and at the time it was just I'd found an editor or someone who knew the editor there, who at least kind of presented to him, and it was weird enough but serious enough that they were interested in the story, and I said, okay, give us an article on it, go up there and shoot some video, we'll see how it looks. And spent a day with the U.S. Fistball team. They explained the sport, and I got to catch some cool stuff on video. And I think it was on, if I remember right, July 11th, 2011 was my first ever ESPN article, which was about 387 words and 2 videos. And, I thought that I was probably never going to write for ESPN again ever after that, or very infrequently. Having been in the business world, I just kind of listened and looked out for other opportunities, and there were other ones after that came up that sort of led to where I'm at now.
Did you ever have any kind of insecurities in trying to pitch stories or write stories in the future after that?
Not really, but I mean, that's kind of me. I was in sales for a long time. So, when you're in sales, whether you're selling, lubricants or nuts and bolts or insurance or, electric guitar strings, you're going to get no, even if you're in a realm of sales and promotions where, it's built on relationships. And what I would say is that freelance sports writing is built, I think all sports writing is built on relationships. You think about the people who are, the NBA and NFL insiders and, people who get access to the ballpark. It's not because they just, called up one day and got the right person, or because, their nephew works there and let them in the back door. Usually there's some building of relationships, there's some track record. So, there's two things. Like, there's that, actually, I'd say there's three things. There's one, just not being afraid. There's two, being straight to the point and realizing that people that you're trying to reach out to, whether it's an editor or a sports club or an agent or whatever, they're busy. And the third thing, I think, is just to be persistent and just kind of present what your idea is. I like to say that I would do what was called the 100-word pitch, where I would try to pitch a story in 100 words or less, and keep it succinct and have a decent, subject line if it was by email. And then if they're interested, they come back to you. If you send a synopsis that's 3 pages worth, no one's going to read that, because no one reads long emails.
Mm-hmm.
And you just got to kind of think about it from your point of view. If you're reading your email or responding to a message, like, what are you going to digest and what are you going to say? Now, I'm not really interested in that, or I'll look at that later because it's too much information. I'm going to go to my fridge and get a beer now. People are busy, and you just got to be straight to the point and kind of let them know what you can offer.
Well, I just want to give a perspective on how we met, because I had launched my podcast in January of 2020, and I did a few weekly to start. And one of my guests that I had who I'd previously worked with was a woman named Mary Kate Shea, who worked for John Hancock, organizing the Boston Marathon and all the elite athletes signings and things like that. And you reached out to me and said you had interviewed her yourself. And I believe I may have seen that article.
Yeah.
But, when you're scrambling to book and plan out everything, you don't really pay attention. And then when I went back and read it, I'm like, yep, I did read that. So when you're trying to find interesting people to interview, what goes into that?
Well, for me, so for the last couple of years, I've built relationships. What it is now is I've built relationships with a lot of publicists and PR firms. And, I write for a business magazine. So if there's a brand or some sort of promotion going on, they have access to an athlete, they're usually interested in kind of pushing it out there. That doesn't mean that my articles have to be a commercial for whatever campaign they're doing.
Sure.
But for example, I've got a contact at one of the PR firms, and they work. I knew that they worked with a number of different athletes. So I'll just say that the client is a sports drink, and it's a pretty good one. And they've got some people that I'm not really as familiar with, and they've got people like Mike Trout, and every once in a while says, hey, if you got Mike Trout available, I'll talk to him. I just kind of joke around about that. But in the beginning with so I keep my options open, or I'll keep my mind open. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. I'm
not just looking for NFL, NBA stars and nobody else. I think probably the first athlete that they had was a female MMA fighter named Michelle Waterston, and I get to interview her. And I didn't really know a ton about her because I don't really follow MMA, but I thought, she's a woman fighter. I want to know how she got into this, and I want to know, what goes through her mind when she fights, and how does she prepare, and how does she train. So that article was a fun one to do, and I just kind of kept in touch with the people who sort of were behind that campaign. And TV, a good one. So one of my favorite interviews this year, and I've kind of been asking for access to this athlete for a while, was Megan Rapinoe. So Megan Rapinoe was in a commercial recently for Body Armor, which I think came out the same weekend as the Tiger and Peyton and Phil and Tom Brady hitting his ball into the water golf event that weekend. And it was premiering that weekend, and I just happened to ask, I think for the third time, about Megan Rapinoe, when they're like, yep, well, we got her now. You want to talk to her? First it was, can you email some questions? And me being my past business salesperson personality, I'm like, I'd really like to talk to her. I think we'd find more value if I could talk to her for 15 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. So yeah, I got the opportunity to interview Megan Rapinoe, and just the same when I talked to Mary Kate Shea about some of the marathon stuff a couple months ago. I try to span the whole spectrum. I mean, there are some things that I'm not going to be super interested in. There are some sporting events that are just a little out there, but with every New York Marathon runner that you get offered, you get someone like Megan Rapinoe or Scottie Pippen, or at least I do.
Sure.
And those great opportunities come up, and I try to treat all the athletes the same. I consider them all serious, and I talk to men and women in all different sports, and it's just sort of I think now people in sports marketing, and I know you talk to probably a lot of them in your podcast realm, they're starting to look for people like me who can talk about the sports, but can also talk about the business and the lifestyle, and the off the field, out of the ballpark stuff. And I don't get as many readers as somebody who focuses only on golf or someone who focuses on football or NASCAR as a specialty, but I've got a lot of cool opportunities, and that's sort of where I'm at.
Well, and I think that's what makes what your articles are more interesting, at least to somebody like me, because I'm a behind the scenes kind of person. I like how things are built, how they got to where they are. And again, the reason why I want you on the show. But it's not just interviewing the athlete. You go a little bit more into that intimate detail, I guess. And by that I mean not just a typical athlete question.
Yeah.
The Deion Sanders article that you did, and if anybody hasn't had the chance to look at that, it was really a short article, but it was interesting on what he's doing, where he's been, and what he's been going through.
Yeah.
And that's what appeals to somebody like me. In a few minutes, I'm going to just kind of go over some of the people that you've talked to, but how do you come up with the ideas of going a little bit in a different direction as far as depth goes?
Well, I just keep it. I mean, there's a couple stock questions or versions of them that I'm probably going to ask almost everybody. But I'm flexible enough, having been in the business world, that I can pivot. And so with Deion Sanders, I thought we were going to talk about the Cowboys, but he's like, yeah, I'm not really following the Cowboys and what they're doing right now. I'm trying to, I'm being my own cowboy. I'm on my ranch. To me, he said, my priority right now in the summer is getting up with my kids every day, having breakfast with them every day, and cutting my grass and chopping logs, and asking me about the Cowboys in September, October. We'll talk about it then, is what he said. He's definitely got a strong personality, and he's he is who he is, but he's a Hall of Fame player, and I'm happy to talk to him about chopping wood and wearing a cowboy as much as I am about what he thinks about the upcoming NFL season, or what he thought about the last Super Bowl. And I think you need to be flexible, and sometimes what happens when you ask questions and you have to pivot, or you get a different answer than you expected, is I think that they're gifts. To give you an obtuse example, probably like 6-7 years ago. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s. So one of the kind of the stars of alternative music when I was growing up is Morrissey, the lead singer of the Smiths. And somehow I got an opportunity to interview him. I guess part of it was that Page 2 kind of let me do a series on aging rock stars and their sports hankering. So I got to interview Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins about his pro wrestling thing that he was doing. And I got to interview Noel Gallagher of Oasis, and we talked about Man City and all the stuff that he was doing sports-wise in his music videos. And somehow I think I just might have pushed the right buttons. I got a yes on Morrissey, and I thought, okay, I'm going to ask him all these, really detailed questions about his football references, his English football references in the songs. And literally every question that I sent, I didn't talk to him. I had to send questions to his PR person in New York. Every question that I asked, he answered it differently. So then the article became about that, and sort of him being this international man of mystery. And I had asked him about whether it was true that he was a Millwall fan. And Millwall is a South London club that has kind of a working class fan base, I guess you could say. And, he kind of just spun it off as a rumor and said he followed the sport more of in a spiritual sense. And he gave me, a typical Morrissey answer. And then it worked out because my editor found a picture of Morrissey wearing a West Ham shirt, which West Ham is, think about bitter rivalries like the Yankees and the Red Sox. That's pretty much Millwall and West Ham. So it was great that I asked these questions and he didn't really answer them, but what content I got made for a pretty good, fun article anyway. And sometimes athletes are like that. You just got to roll with it. And sometimes you get them a day where they don't really want to talk about that thing that you want to talk about. But if you are open to letting them speak and be who they are, you're going to find some cool stuff, and it's going to show up in your work.
I haven't really interviewed a ton of athletes, nowhere near what the number you have, but as part of a broadcast, we would sit them down and occasionally sit in on the interview and craft that. And I found too that sometimes it's just a nuisance. They just want to go, they want to prepare, and most of it was before the game that they were going to be performing in. So have you found any kind of tools that or tactics that maybe can open up a little bit more from the athlete's perspective to say, yeah, I think I might want to at least talk to this guy?
I don't know if there's any tools. I just think it's keeping it conversational. And so, I'll admit I've got a lot of cool opportunities. But so, for example, I got to interview Greg Norman at the beginning of the year, the legendary golfer, and sort of the pretense was he had unveiled another. One of the things that Greg Norman does, he's a huge businessman. He actually does golf course design. And I think people think of Greg Norman in terms of, playing golf and then his, his sportswear or his, activewear that you see in like Macy's and stuff. But a bigger piece of his business is golf course design. So we talked about that. And I don't know nearly as much about rocks and flowers and coasts and, sunlight on plants as he does. So there's only certain things I kind of asked him more about his motivation, how it started. But I was interested somewhere along the line. I just thought, I want to ask him like about the mental aspect of golf. And I think golfers are asked about that. But I said, like, when you're having a really bad day on the golf course, what do you do? Because we think that you're successful all the time, but I know that, you had bad days, or you had days where, you're fighting the competition to win this thing. And he just kind of let it out and just said, here's what I do. And he talked about a little man in his head that's kind of like a pep talk guy who's, he'd be on the 18th hole and he might win or lose it on a putt. And the little man that he talked about would be like, okay, you ready to play, Greg, or not? You want to win this thing, or are you tapping out today? So that was kind of funny to hear him talk about the little man in his head, because I think we all have a little person in our head who's like, are you ready for this? I think it's a big mental aspect of everybody's game to have sort of an internal monologue. And, I wasn't going to be theatrical and ask about, so tell me about your internal monologue. I just straight up wanted to ask him what he did, on a bad day of golf. And I think people warm up to those real questions versus, I think if you try to be clever and ask them something about, what they thought about that finite shot of the Masters last year, or test their knowledge, or, I'll give you another example. I got to interview Venus Williams about 2 years ago, right before the U.S. Open. And she's pretty introverted and she's kind of guarded. And to prepare for that interview, I just went on YouTube, and what I found was, at least on that day that I searched YouTube on Venus Williams, it seemed like every time she gets asked questions, they're completely stupid questions and invasive and annoying. And they're asking her about stuff that has nothing to do with tennis. And I watched that and I thought, okay, I'm just going to be a real person with her. I'm going to ask her about her motivation and what it's like to play and who she likes to play against, and what she does for fun and inspiration off the court. And she, at the end of the interview, she actually thanked me for that and acknowledged that she gets asked a lot of dumb questions by tennis journalists. So I think it's just be real and be authentic with people and have a conversation with them. You are going to get somebody who's, bigger than life that you get to interview every once in a while. And sometimes that makes you nervous, but they're all, everyone's a person. So treat them like a person.
One of the articles that you had written, or at least the person that you had interviewed, was Teddy Atlas. And that kind of is close to me because I covered boxing while I was at ESPN, and I was set to produce boxing for the Olympics this coming year. Well, about now, but obviously that didn't happen for NBC Sports. And I found your interview with Teddy Atlas kind of interesting. I'd kind of heard different pieces of what it was like, but there was a surprise for me a little bit in his answer on Mike Tyson's record.
I only printed half of what he said.
I'm sure.
I was not going to lay out there. I'm like, we're just going to stick to the boxing piece.
Right.
Here. But anyway, go on.
No, but it was interesting because those are the I think, at least from my perspective, those are kind of the surprise answers. Can you go into what that interview was like and give maybe a little context of what we're talking about here as far as what you guys were talking about?
Yeah, no, he was training a boxer, I think, if I remember right, for an up and coming fight, and it was sort of a lesser known boxer. It was he was kind of presented to me as sort of this sort of the sleeper boxing trainer who could really take it. I think like a Seabiscuit type story, like somebody who could take any sort of person who's just sort of average and make him really play to his limits. So, and he's pretty loud and he's very opinionated. So we asked about boxing. I didn't say, so what do you think about Mike Tyson? I don't even remember where that comment came up. Yeah, I think boxing it's like golf and the NFL, and that that has some very big names that everybody knows, that sort of get maybe overrepresented in the sport. And then there's all these great little stories that unless you follow the sport, you're not going to hear about too much. So we talked kind of about that dynamic because I figured that there was a common denominator that he has as a boxing trainer, as a coach, that's got to be the same whether he's coaching, the heavyweight champion of the world or somebody who's, just coming up, who's trying to get into the Olympics. So he kind of just told me, he's kind of like, this is how I do it. And I sort of asked him about how that, sort of his approach to boxing, why it's so successful. And I probably mentioned a couple of successful boxers.
Mm-hmm.
And, he kind of, I guess when it comes to Mike Tyson, some of the other people, he kind of said, like, just the same, I can train anybody who's willing to be trained, and boxers got to have discipline and coachability. Like, you can have the hardest hit in the world and you can maybe knock out anybody theoretically, but if you don't, adhere to a certain way of training and a certain commitment level, you may win a big fight one day, but you're going to underperform the next. And that was sort of how that was, his opinion. That was his mantra. And he gave me a couple of examples of, people that he thought really didn't live up to the expectations that they could have, or maybe conducted themselves in a way outside boxing that he felt that the discipline and coachability should have helped them do. So that's, his answers were very interesting, and he's definitely if you get him on the mic, you're going to get some good stuff out of Teddy Atlas. That's for sure.
Well, and what I was referring to is in the article, it says, "Do you know what Mike Tyson's record was?" Atlas asked me. And then after rechecking my facts, 50-6 with 44 knockouts, I told him, Atlas weighed in on that. You know what Mike Tyson's record was for me? He's 0-6. Because a fight is not a fight until there is resistance. When he gave you that answer, what did you think at that point?
I wasn't really surprised because, I think probably in the beginning of the interview, he was pretty headstrong about his philosophy. And I think with probably the best of coaches, whether they're someone like Teddy Atlas that only boxing people know, or if it's Vince Lombardi, they have a philosophy about life and a philosophy about sports, and they tend to be tied together pretty tight. So, if he's telling me that the fights that Tyson won under him were probably the easiest ones, that they weren't really wins, then he knows something we don't. And that's sort of example we're talking about, where someone you may have had a knockout fight, you may have won the race, you may have won the big game, but I've just got done watching The Last Dance, as I'm sure a lot of people out there have, and whether you like the Bulls and Michael Jordan or not, you gotta you sort of look at it's in sports, it's sports too competitive, and it's very seldom that we see people who rise above a couple of championships and make a dynasty. And I think with boxing, it's a little bit tougher of a sport. There's not too many sports where you take punches in the face. So I think to be a champion, you have a shorter time to do it. And it probably takes a lot more commitment, and just, I don't know, a certain level of strength that has got to be present every moment. And then if you have a coach a coach and a trainer who can identify, what to work with, then that's really where the best in the sport come out.
Now, I mentioned earlier that we would list off some of the people you've interviewed. Obviously, I can't list them all, but some of the ones that I would like to mention, if you have any kinds of thoughts on what that interview was like briefly, I think that would be a nice perspective on just kind of how you approached it and what you got out of it.
Sure.
Andres Cantor. As many people may know, some people may not, the guy that says goal for about 20 minutes after a score. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. People are like, oh, I know that guy. Yeah. I didn't. Yeah. Well, it's weird because I had to wait for a call from him in the beginning of the World Cup. He was in Russia, so I don't know what time it was over there. And he was pretty opinionated too. He was like, I think what it was, if I remember right, it might have been after Germany was pretty much like, Germany's not going to the next round because they were underperforming, and they got beat pretty bad a couple of times. And he had laid out there his opinion about the way that the Germany's coach was, how he picked the team, and then how he screwed up by not picking, one player to the next. And he was just, but he was conversational and fun, but it's just the same. Like, he was the nicest guy in the world, but he laid out what his hardcore opinion was about certain teams that, didn't have it right, and who were other ones that were underestimated. And I asked him about England, and I was surprised that he actually said, England's, usually everybody's been beating down England for a number of years, but the last time around, I think it was, they were a complete team. So he was just like a fun dude and easygoing, but, had the goods prepared to talk to me in the 10 minutes or whatever that we talked to during his call from Russia while I was back here in Chicago watching the World Cup.
Dr. J, Julius Irving.
Well, so I grew up in Philadelphia. He's like one of my lifelong heroes, and long before Jordan was flying in the air, if you wanted to see someone fly in the air and dunk a basketball, it was Dr. J. And he's he's one of those players that maybe it's a generational thing. He's just like a chill guy, and he's a gentleman. And when I had connected. Actually, this one came from a friend, my friend Kurt, who lives out in L.A. He was working for Big Three at the time. Big Three is the 3-on-3 league that's owned by Ice Cube. And we talked a little bit about it. I'm a Cubs fan, and Kurt is a trash-talking Sox fan from Chicago who lives in L.A., and then he likes the Dodgers, which just makes it worse. But we were talking about Big Three, and I said, are any of the coaches or players talking? I was actually more interested in the coaches, and I think I just threw out there's a joke like, you get me Dr. J, I'd love to talk to him. And he's like, okay, well, let's do that. So the cool part about Big Three is that obviously, nothing's going on right now, but each weekend they have their games in a different city. So that weekend it was in Chicago. I was actually supposed to meet with Dr. J in person, but his flight got screwed up, so we just did it on the phone. And he's just like he's just a person. He's a gentleman. I asked him about his career. I kind of wanted to know what it was like coaching in this league, post NBA. I think Big Three is pretty impressive, and I'm not a huge super fan of hoops, but I think the product works, even though it's with NBA retirees and it's 3-on-3 half-court basketball. I think it works, and I wanted to kind of know what he saw in certain players and what it was like to coach that, having done everything, having been an all-star, having won an NBA championship himself in 83 with the Sixers. And just the same, we kept it conversational. He was actually kind of interested in what I thought about basketball and what I thought about his career. And I was like, well, why do you care? Why do you care what I think? I mean, you're the best. So yeah. I mean, he's another one. Just kind of be real and keep it conversational, and you get gifts that come up in the interview. And he was great.
All right, Annika Sorenstam, one of the best golfers in history.
Yes, Annika is. So I got invited. I got to go down to Arnold Palmer Invitational back in the first week of March, and when I was getting down there, I thought I was just going to kind of mull around and write about it. I didn't really know what was going on, and I got kind of a late itinerary of the weekend handed to me, and like, oh well, so this is new, but you're going to have a putting lesson with Annika Sorenstam tomorrow, and I'm like, okay, I can make time for that, and that's what it was. I mean, it was probably like 10 o'clock on a Tuesday or whatever day it was that I was there, the first kind of the opening day of API. And Annika, she's really down to earth. She's, she comes off as like Scandinavian when you first meet her. Like, she's kind of seems sort of serious, but then she's got a kind of a funny sense of humor that pops up a little bit. And she's not sarcastic, but she jokes around with you. She told me I was a good putter a couple times, which it was probably not true, but she cheered me on. So I got to putt with her, and we just, I think I started asking her questions just about like, all right, was this hard for you? Like, did you learn how to do what you just told me to do when you were like 13, or were you 5 when you mastered it, or what, Actually, her husband is her manager, so he was nearby, and after that, I took my token picture with her because it was a big deal for me to meet like a golf legend, one of the greatest golfers of all time. And so we hooked up the interview kind of on the spot. I said to my husband and manager, I was like, I'd love to talk to you, and he actually said that to me first. And so when we talked a week later, I wanted to know about, because I know one thing that's important to her is to see other women, make it in golf. Sure. And she talked about when she was growing up in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s, that, we didn't have ESPN and 500 other channels all day long. She a lot of times couldn't see Nancy Lopez and all the other, top women players that she read about them in magazines, and then would watch what was available on, the TV in Sweden, which was usually just the big stuff like, the Masters and the PGA Championship. So I think she wants to cultivate a bigger scene for women, also knowing that there's a lot of really great women golfers out there. Lexi Thompson is awesome to watch, and Brooke Henderson, and there's a lot of really good ones that I think are as good as the men. And the other thing that she's working on to be called I think it's called the Swedish Open. There's going to be a tournament that she and Henrik Stenson are working on. Women are going to compete in the same tournament. Whoever's the best, it's going to be kind of a new thing in golf. Talking with her about like all these things that she's developing, now that she's retired from her competitive career, she's pretty busy. but she's passionate about women in golf and kind of bringing golf to the world. I think that's a common theme that you see among people who have been successful in golf. Like they want someone who lives in India or Nepal or China or Argentina who is passionate about picking up the club to participate. It's sort of becoming a new global sport, I think, in terms of as far reaches. So she's inspiring as hell with that, and then she's down to earth and just she's just like a regular person. And I didn't watch a ton of her. I didn't watch a ton of golf when she was at the top of her game, but just hearing her stories just makes me think, damn, I wish I could have been there with her. Like I wish I was, when she hit that 59 score, that I was there to watch it. I mean, I think all sports fans are like that. There's kind of like classic sporting events you wish you were there back in time, and she's one of those people that makes you want to watch more golf.
All right, one more, and then we'll continue on with just some more of the details of how you do your job.
Sure.
Jim Plunkett.
Jim Plunkett, I grew up in Philadelphia again. The Eagles were in Super Bowl 15, and they got basically walloped by the Raiders. That was 1980. And I have a couple friends who are diehard Raiders fans, and none of them grew up in Oakland. So to talk to him, it's funny. If you listen to the beginning of the sound bites of my interviews, I will often disclose my fandom. And so I brought it up with him. I said, you really killed my team back in 1980 with that Super Bowl. He's like, yeah, sorry about that. We had to do what we had to do to win. He's, so he's among Raiders fans. He's, one of the biggest of all time. But
right.
If you walk out of the street and ask some random person what they think about Tom Brady, they'll tell you. But ask them about what they think about Jim Plunkett, they probably won't know, who he is necessarily. He, I didn't realize how many issues he had with concussions back when he was playing, and it was sort of under the radar in the late 70s and early 80s, more than it is today for sure. But he was connected with a company that has to do with concussions and brain health and education, and let him talk about that, and learned a couple things about football that I didn't know. But also, even though he hasn't really played since the early 80s, talking to him about the Raiders and where the Raiders are going and sort of the legacy of the Raiders was pretty cool too. I mean, he's definitely a hero in that circle, but like a lot of the other professional athletes I've talked to, he's a Super Bowl champion, but he's a down to earth regular guy too. So that is always inspiring to me.
Yeah, well, you definitely have a very impressive roster of people you've interviewed, and it's everyone, not just the legends, but those who may be just starting out or people who are just interesting, I think. So how do you map out or plan who you would like to talk to? I know you mentioned a little bit of it earlier, but does it have something to do with Forbes, or are you pretty much on your own and trying to come up with something?
Well, it's a little bit more freeform than you might think. So the way that Forbes work, at least, the rung that I write for, which is sort of the sports business aspect of it, is they're pretty laissez-faire. Like it essentially runs like a blog in terms of that I don't have to pitch an article to an editor. I don't do kind of recaps or play-by-plays. I don't really focus on predictions for this weekend or the draft or whatever. So I don't, and maybe it's laziness, maybe it's just not my interest. I'm not looking to be breaking news on anything. It's more, I'm fascinated with a lot of quirky things about sports. Like, so to give you an example, I'm fascinated with the fact that, at least my generation, if you were Irish Catholic or Catholic and you played football at Catholic school, you wanted to play at Notre Dame. And it doesn't matter if you're from Idaho or New Jersey or South Bend, Indiana. But nobody goes to USC because they're Methodist, at least not as far as I know. Historically, like my dad's generation, if you were Italian, you were a Yankees fan. Again, it doesn't really matter where you live, but probably had something to do with Joe DiMaggio and Phil Rizzuto and some of those players. So I'm interested in just kind of a lot of the anecdotes and the culture of sports. So I look for that, but I'm also pretty open to what is going on. So I just, coming up this week, it's, the first week of August, the PGA Championship is coming up. I got a chance to talk to one of my favorite golfers, Justin Rose, who is, he plays well in majors, but he's not been playing super well recently. But so we talked about that rather than predicting who's going to do what. I wanted to know, like, you're a golfer, you've been doing this for a while. You tend to play better and bigger bigger events. So tell me about that. So, that's a timely example of something that might come up. But then sometimes I just, get an opportunity to talk to an athlete, like Jim Plunkett in the middle of the summer when it's not quite football season, or Scottie Pippen I got to talk to a couple weeks ago. I actually was told that I wasn't allowed to ask him about The Last Dance, some ESPN special, but there's other things I wanted to talk to him about. And I asked him about the Olympics. The Olympics aren't going on, but I thought that he probably wanted to talk about the '92 Dream Team, and apparently that was a bigger thing to him than most of the things in his career. And he was really excited about talking about the Olympics and what it meant to him. So it's a little freeform and random, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that I pretty much cover every sport, and I'll have a conversation with anybody. I don't really have idols, but I look at what like David Feherty does on the Golf Channel, and I love it that he talks to top golfers. And then he just interviewed Kenny G for some reason last week, in which I don't know if Kenny G plays golf or how they came up, but hell, it must be an interesting interview. So yeah, I mean, sometimes if you just sort of are open to doing different things, a lot of neat things happen. So I just try to be open, and you just kind of come what may.
So when you're preparing for interviews with people, two parts to this question. One,
Yeah.
how much preparation do you do? And then two, because I think people may think that you have a ton of time to spend with these people. Sometimes I would guess it's only 5 minutes, maybe 10.
Well, you have like 10 to 20, 15 to 20.
Yeah.
Kind of depends, but that's a lot of it.
Yeah. So how do you prepare for something that for an interview you're doing?
Well, so it's pretty rare that it's, I get an email or a call. Do you want to talk to this athlete, now or tomorrow or tonight? That's pretty rare, but sometimes it happens. But usually I have a couple days lead time on scheduling time with an athlete on the phone for next week. So I kind of let it mull around in my mind and think, well, what would I like to talk to them about? Besides the hardcore stuff of their sport or whatever event is coming up that they're playing in. Yeah, just kind of take some mental notes, and then sometime usually the day before the interview, I go, I really need to look online to make sure I know exactly like when they won that thing or when they played when they won this championship. And so I do a little bit of research, but then I just kind of plot my conversational questions the night before, the morning of, again, knowing that I'm not going to be reading a script and they're probably not going to answer a question word for word like I would assume that they would. So, but there's a lot of questions that I will tend to ask most of the athletes, like, who were you inspired when you first got in the sport? Who were you inspired? Who did you love to watch? And whether it's Anthony Rizzo telling me that he, loved Gary Sheffield and Derek Jeter, or, somebody telling me about some athlete that I'd never heard of. It's, those answers are always interesting, whether or not you get the answer that you were prepared for. So again, it's just keep it conversational and being authentic with the people, but also knowing enough about the subject that you could ask them the important questions, but pivot. So I wouldn't say that I spend like hours of time. I definitely don't script a lot of stuff the way that you might if you were doing a sit-down TV interview. But yeah, the preparation is just sort of more my curiosity about their philosophy and about their sport and how they play their game.
Yeah, and I think you hit the key word there in your last response was curious. And I think that just having talked to you over the course of this hour, you seem like a naturally curious person. I mean, in order to change careers or pivot careers from what you were doing before to now.
Yeah, that's true.
So speaking of that then, and being a naturally curious person, who have been some of your influences on your writing career?
It's so one thing that there's not really like my favorite sports interviewer growing up was Dick Schaap. I think it was just because, again, he was, seemed like a regular person. He's very conversational, and, he never tried to ask a gag question or something controversial. He's like the opposite of Jim Gray, for example. He just wants to know the athletes, and he wants, people viewing him to know the athletes. So that was probably one of them. But the other thing was I always used to love reading sports articles in non-sports publications, and that's probably why I write what I write for Forbes. I love reading like the Saturday version of the New York Times. You usually have some great sports articles when I was growing up, or sometimes you'll see a sports article in The Economist where they're just out of the blue write about Barcelona FC and the economics of European soccer, or International Herald Tribune, or actually a long time ago, the New York Observer used to have some pretty good sports articles, along with their weird police blotter. Their crime reports were just sort of off the wall. So I think, from that probably I've sort of copied that mentality, and that I'm not necessarily looking for the big quote from right after the game, or, I've done play-by-plays before as a writer, but that's not sort of my mentality on sports. It's more an interviewing, curiosity-based type of writing. And that just comes, I think, from what I read, as a kid, with a couple of newspapers around the house, and, CBS Sports and ABC Wide World of Sports. I grew up in a different time than we probably see on TV now, and I think it just sort of informed. And that, and combined with my sales career and business career, I think it's all sort of morphed into a different type of narrative than what you might learn in a journalism class at Syracuse or Northwestern.
And just mentioning, the time, because I grew up, I think, in the same time period that you did, and things were a lot different with the amount of media available. But now that you're in this environment now, what would you give it for advice to somebody who's thinking about writing, or maybe wants to be in the industry that you're in, as far as maybe what to look out for, maybe some things to avoid, things of that nature?
I would just say be entrepreneurial, keep your options open, go for small wins in the beginning. One thing I've seen some sports writers I know do is they only want to do one. I mean, yeah, if all you know is golf and you want to do a golf blog, go for it. But if you get the chance to write for a local newspaper or something as big as ESPN, even if it's on one of their back pages that you think nobody reads, if you're open to different things, then you get really cool opportunities. So I mean, I never would have got, probably give you an example, I never would have got to interview a bunch of world famous rock stars about their sports hankerings if I hadn't done a bunch of quirky stuff that probably hardly anybody read on ESPN early on. Or I sort of kind of, if you remember the video game Frogger, where the frog kind of jumps on different lily pads that goes, and it's sort of like, go to the next opportunity, try to stay alive, try to stay in the game, go to the next one. It's really been that, so that, having been in Chicago, I've been in Chicago for 25 years now, but a couple of years into the game, I had made a connection here, just a friend who said, you should write for Red Eye, which is the Tribune's, it was basically a Tribune's kind of like sports and entertainment weekly. And actually, well, not weekly, it came out, I think, every day for a while. And, pitch a couple of things, and they said no a couple of times. And after pitching a couple of unique ideas, more often than not, I was writing about the Cubs and the Bears, to Chicago readers who probably picked up Red Eye to read it while they're on the train. And it got me, I think my first athlete interview was with Matt Forte. And I remember it was during the bye week, right before they played the Packers. So I remember it was during the, they were good one week, and then they had a bye week, and then they pretty much went down the toilet after that. But I got to talk to Matt Forte about some web comedy series that he was doing. It was called Tough Season, and the synopsis was, it was a couple of improv guys who did this kind of fantasy football league where they're like in the fantasy football league with professional athletes, and they're trying to like win fantasy football. But even though they have athletes, like they know the athletes personally, like Wes Welker and Matt Forte, like they still are terrible at fantasy football. So I kind of wanted to know, like, well, is Matt Forte a funny guy? He's in this web comedy series. Well, he's got to be funny somewhat, and he talked about that. He's kind of introverted sort of dude, but that one interview with a professional athlete sort of opened the door to like, oh, you interview professional athletes. Well, who else would you be interested in? I started getting, very slowly getting connections with people in sports marketing and PR who might have other athletes that came up. And that's, fast forward, having my name under the Forbes logo helps because it's, a legit business entity. And if anybody, has an athlete that's doing something cool in sports business, they want to talk to somebody like me about it and see some articles out there. So, I haven't, it's weird because I feel like I've gotten to interview most of my sports idols, both the new ones like Megan Rapinoe and the old ones from back when I was a kid, like Julius Irving. And, there's a couple more I want to interview, but, I've gotten to do, I think, probably more than I ever thought I would have, 10 years ago when I started that little blog that my 8 friends that I begged, read whenever I put up a blog post. So.
Well, I really enjoy, some of your articles. Some of them are surprising to me. They're really short, but there are other ones that are more involved. And I'm really glad you got in touch with me, because now I look for your stuff, and it's really fun to read. Now, you also have a podcast that you started, 2 months ago?
Not even. I just put up my second my second episode. Once I had to learn how to use the software on a microphone once again. It's called 28 Minutes of Sports, or the
Right.
28 Minutes Podcast. It's on Spotify. Episode 1 is about golf, and literally what it was I took some of those great interviews that I had with Greg Norman and Annika and Justin Rose, and there's a couple sound bites from Brooks Koepka and some other professional golfers. I just kind of wanted to ask them, I think in my interviews I had asked them what really inspires you, or they went off on these tangents about why they love golf so much. So
yeah,
the podcast is really my attempt to be either the Anthony Bourdain of sports, or kind of do this American life of sports, where we said, we're sitting down with Greg Norman. He mentioned this weird thing that he did, on the golf course one day. So episode 1's on golf. Episode 2 is about the Cubs, and just got started with it. But hope to have some more good material out there soon on 28 Minutes.
Best of luck, because I've obviously gone through the podcast and developing it and all that stuff. It's a lot of work. So, but it sounds really interesting. I'm going to take a listen. I haven't had the chance to, because as I was doing my research on you, I discovered that. So best of luck to that. So how can people find out more about what you're doing? I know obviously Forbes, but is there anywhere else they can find some of the articles that you've written?
Yeah, well, I post everything on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @SportyFrye, and it's FRYE, so it's Sporty Frye, 2 words connected. And my Instagram, my very scantily followed Instagram, is the same thing. I'm sure you can search me on Google, and Andy Frye Sport, and Andy Frye Forbes is pretty. There's usually, I'm doing something every week, and I think one of the places you and I connected was on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is pretty underrated as far as a place to put, a link to your podcast, a link to your latest sports interview or article, whatever people are doing, because even serious business people at work want to kind of, stop working for a few minutes. And if you go on LinkedIn, it's a little bit better excuse than going on Facebook and dorking around there. So I find that I get a lot of people connecting with me and reading my stuff from LinkedIn, which, it doesn't really seem like it's a natural fit for a sports writer to post their stuff. But I think it's pretty good. So any of the socials, LinkedIn or @SportyFrye, that's where I'm at.
Gotcha. Well, I've had a great time hearing your backstory and all the people you've got to interview. I'm sure we could talk a lot more about all those people that you have talked with, but thank you for joining me on this podcast, and I wish you the best of luck with everything with you in your podcasting career and in your writing career going forward.
Thanks, man. I appreciate you giving me a chance to talk about sports.
Yeah, no, it's always fun talking sports. So thanks again.
Cool.
All right, that was Andy Frye, sports writer and contributor to Forbes. I learned a lot from this conversation, but I didn't know a lot about the writing part of it. So it was really interesting to hear how Andy is able to get interviews, and then what his formula is for making his articles interesting. I'll throw in a few more names of athletes he's interviewed, including U.S. soccer legend Brandi Chastain, NASCAR driver Dale Earnhardt Jr., Chicago Bulls legend Scottie Pippen, Olympic swimmer and 4-time gold medalist Dara Torres, and retired San Francisco 49er, NFL Hall of Famer, and ESPN NFL analyst Steve Young. You can find a complete list of Andy's articles at andyfrye.com by visiting Forbes.com or finding him on social media. And since recording this episode, I had the chance to check out his new podcast, 28 Minutes of Sport, and it's very well thought out, unique in its presentation, weaving audio clips from some of the athletes he's interviewed and giving a bit of his behind-the-scenes interaction with them. It's really entertaining and educational. Again, that's 28 Minutes of Sport with Andy Frye. And I'd love for you to subscribe to this podcast as well, so you can catch both previous and upcoming episodes where I talk with people in the sports and sports broadcasting industry who have made an impact on how sports are viewed and read throughout the world. Episodes are released every other Thursday through the summer. Some of my previous guests include Chris Farrow, former coordinating producer for college basketball at ESPN, John Howard, technical director for Sunday Night Football on NBC, Tom Van Berg, thoroughbred horse trainer and son of legendary trainer Jack Van Berg, and Ben Boma, network TV sports producer and sports management consultant. All of my guests have been really entertaining and give great insights into what they do and where their career paths have taken them. If you have any suggestions on what you'd like to know more about in sports, drop me a line at sportsinthemaking.com or contact me on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And if you have any questions for me or my guests, I love to share them on the show. Wherever you listen to this podcast, I'd appreciate it if you like it, share it, and leave positive reviews on your social media channels. Also be sure to subscribe to Sports in the Making so you don't miss out on more episodes, and you can catch up on the previous ones there as well. I'm your host, Don Cardona. Thank you for listening to Sports in the Making.